Here's an interesting graph. Americans were asked whether or not they approved of different Chinese leaders. 8 of them were current or former Chinese leaders, and 1 is an imaginary Chinese person they threw in there. If this is accurate, the one thing we can conclude from it is that most Americans don't know much about China. But there's more we can learn from the results. First, some context behind the poll. It's from Blue Rose Research, and they polled over 2,000 people. That's pretty good. Blue Rose Research is aligned with the Democratic Party. I don't know exactly how that would affect the results of this poll, but keep in mind it could have. These leaders are listed in order of familiarity. So Xi Jinping is the one most Americans are familiar with, and Wang Zhiyong, who doesn't exist, is the one least familiar to Americans. Only 48% of Americans have an opinion on Xi Jinping, the current president of the People's Republic of China. One could look at this and say that over half of Americans don't know who Xi Jinping is, but that other 52% probably includes people who would say, Xi Jinping, I think he's the leader of China, right? But they don't have any strong opinions on him. To be fair, when I first started learning Chinese, I couldn't tell you anything about Xi Jinping, though I feel like he wasn't the constant presence in the news that he would be later on. Side note, I definitely had no idea who Ming Zhou was. So we can see that Xi Jinping is clearly the most famous Chinese leader today in America. 7% approval and 41% disapproval, meaning that of those who have a strong opinion on Xi Jinping, 15% approve. Almost 2/3 of Americans either haven't heard of Mao Zedong or have no opinion on him, which is just sad. You're supposed to learn about him in school, at least. He was the first leader of the People's Republic of China. He died 50 years ago. 4% approval and 31% disapproval. Of those who have a strong opinion of Mao, only 11% approve. When excluding those who don't have a strong opinion either way, Mao has the lowest approval percentage, but some others come close. I'm trusting that most of you are at least somewhat familiar with Xi Jinping or Mao Zedong, but I might need to go into more detail about everyone else. Deng Xiaoping was a pivotal leader of the People's Republic of China, basically responsible for most things you associate with modern China. And yes, that's Jimmy Carter right next to him. 4% approval, 24% disapproval. Out of those who had an opinion, only 14% of them approved. Deng Xiaoping led what's called reform and opening up. This is how you get Gucci plus hammer and sickle. He said that Mao Zedong was 70% right and 30% wrong, that it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice, and to get rich is glorious. He enacted the one-child policy. He ordered the crackdown on the Tiananmen Square protesters in 1989. Deng Xiaoping's middle character means little, and here is his signature. You can see that the character for little is smaller. Chiang Kai-shek is described as a historical figure rather than a former leader, which is odd considering he only died 1 year before Mao Zedong, but whatever. 6% approval, 16% disapproval. Of those who had an opinion, 27% approve. This is the highest approval of any Chinese leader on this poll. And Chiang is one of only 2 non-communist leaders on this list. His party was the Kuomintang, and he led China against Japan in World War II and fought against Mao Zedong. As Mao Zedong was winning the Chinese Civil War in 1949, Chiang moved the capital to Taipei in Taiwan. He threatened to invade the Chinese mainland and end communist rule. Chiang's China was the Republic of China, which exists in Taiwan, and Mao's China was the People's Republic of China. Chiang Kai-shek died in Taiwan in 1975. Hu Jintao was the guy who was in charge before Xi Jinping. 3% approval, 15% disapproval. Of those who had an opinion, 17% approved. Of all the communist rulers, who is the most popular among Americans? This does not surprise me. He's seen as more friendly with the West and maybe slightly more liberal than other communist leaders. He's still alive, but he hasn't been seen in public for a while. Zhou Enlai was a contemporary of Mao Zedong. 2% approval, 14% disapproval. Of those who had an opinion, 13% approved. Zhou wasn't at the top, but he did try to rein in some of Mao's excessive tendencies. He also was important in getting Nixon to visit China. Zhou died in 1976, the same year as Mao Zedong, but earlier in the year. Sun Yat-sen actually lived in America for a while. There's a statue of him in Hawaii, and is the second non-communist on this list. 4% approved, 11% disapproved. Of those who had an opinion, 27% approved. Sun Yat-sen was a leader in the first democratic revolution in Asia in 1911, and he founded the Kuomintang. He was the first president of the Republic of China. Sadly, he was almost immediately forced to abdicate in favor of General Yuan Shikai, and then Yuan became the dictator. But Yuan Shikai didn't live for very long, and China fell into warlordism. Sun was allied with the new Chinese Communist Party in order to get Soviet support for reuniting China. Sun Yat-sen is generally seen positively in mainland China, Taiwan, and overseas Chinese communities. He died in 1925 and was succeeded by Chiang Kai-shek, who would preside over conflict between the Kuomintang and the Communists. Jiang Zemin was the guy who came after Deng Xiaoping. He died a few years ago at the age of 96. 2% approved, 13% disapproved. Out of those who had an opinion, 13% approved. He continued Deng's economic reforms, and the People's Republic of China joined the World Trade Organization. Oh, he was the one who banned Falun Gong in 1999, thus causing many Falun Gong practitioners to flee China. And that's how Shenyun became a thing. The pollsters also threw in a fake Chinese name, Wang Zhiyong. 2% approved, 9% disapproved. 89% didn't give an answer. This is kind of sad. If you asked Americans in the 40s or 50s if they knew about Chiang Kai-shek or Mao Zedong, they'd almost certainly say yes, and they'd have an opinion on both of them. So what can we learn from this? Well, as we saw with Wang Zhiyong, 2% of Americans will say, China good in any situation. And 9% will always say, China bad. But since the individual leaders were rated differently, we can tell that at least some portion of the American population distinguishes between different Chinese leaders. They can distinguish between KMT and communist leaders, and they can distinguish between hardliners and moderates. But it's a small percentage. Xi Jinping is the most famous Chinese leader in America. Jiang Zemin is the least. Chiang Kai-shek is the most popular, while his enemy Mao Zedong is the least popular. The two Kuomintang leaders were still rated negatively, but they were way more popular than the communist leaders. This is understandable, as Sun Yat-sen had American connections and led a democratic revolution. Chiang Kai-shek fought Japan in World War II and communists in the Cold War. It should come as no surprise that these two were the more popular leaders here. Chiang Kai-shek was only barely more popular than Sun Yat-sen. There was a pretty big gap between the two non-communist leaders and the most popular communist leader, Hu Jintao. So at least some Americans know a little bit about China's pre-communist history. While this poll was interesting, I'd like to see more polls done on this subject. It might be interesting to see a poll of Chinese American opinions of these people as well. Do you think this poll is accurate? What do you think about the leaders featured on this poll? Let me know in the comments.